Rome in the late 4th century. Temples to Jupiter and Apollo stand in ruins or have been converted into churches, and even the emperor attends mass presided over by a bishop, the sign of the cross, now more familiar than the old pagan altars. It's quite a transformation. You see, 3 centuries earlier, Christianity was nothing but an obscure and often maligned sect within the empire. Its followers were persecuted, derided as atheists for denying the Roman gods, and in the worst of times used as human tortures in Nero's gardens. By the end of the 300s, however, this once persecuted faith had managed to become the official religion of the Roman Empire, altering the course of Western civilization forever. But how did we get to this fork in the road? It's quite a dramatic conversion. That is the question that we're looking at today. How exactly did Rome become Christian? What theological debates and political decisions mark that journey from a crucified Christ to a triumphant church? It's not just a simple tale of triumph. It's rather complex. A lot of moving parts. Political power, cultural change, theological conviction, all tightly interwoven. It's going to be a long video, but we'll take it slow, don't worry. Before we begin, though, I have to give you the customary welcome. It's only in good manners, don't you think? Welcome. If you're new here, I do invite you to hit the subscribe button. Those inclined to do so can move the mouse cursor or your index finger over to the like button. And if you really want to make my day, you can leave a little comment. That certainly helps the algorithm too. Now, remember, this channel is 100% ad-free. We are funded by the generous contributions on the Patreon, YouTube memberships, and anyone who chooses to donate through the PayPal link in the pinned comment, or donation through YouTube. We've also got a merch store as well, so I'd like to see some goodies on there. Now, with all that out of the way, introductions all done, let's go back to the very early days, and we can begin with early Christianity, which firmly sits itself within a pagan empire. So how did this all come about? Well, Christianity entered the world of the Roman Empire as one religious movement among many, and very unlikely candidate to ever become dominant. It sprang from a small group of the disciples of Jesus in Judea, kind of a provincial backwater of the empire, and at first it attracted converts mostly among the lower classes and slaves, which is kind of antithetical to the old pagan ways. You think you'd be attracting the great warriors and kings, the strong and all the rest, but Christianity was kind of the opposite. You see, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the new faith had spread gradually through the urban networks. Travelers, merchants, and missionaries, of course, like the Apostle Paul, carried the message along Rome's roads and sea lanes. Small Christian communities popped up in major cities such as Ephesus, Antioch, Alexandria, and even in Rome itself, just within a few decades of the crucifixion. These early believers met in homes or discreet gathering places to practice their rites, out of the public eye, of course. Think about things like the Eucharist meal, very Christian things of that nature. But to many educated Romans, Christians were a strange and suspect group who were viewed as a secretive cult at best, and at worst, subversive. Roman society in this era, of course, was fundamentally pagan, meaning it was polytheistic, that meaning having many gods as opposed to monotheistic, having one, and of course invested in the traditional worship of many of these gods and divine honors paid to the emperors. If you want to be a good citizen, you were expected to participate in public sacrifices and emperor worship ceremonies. These were, of course, thought to secure divine favor for the community, which, of course, meant if you did not contribute to these, well, the opposite of divine favor, divine wrath. Nobody wants that, don't they? In come the Christians, with their refusal to sacrifice to any god but their own, and very stubbornly clinging to that. This was an invisible deity that they claimed was the one and only true God, and this earned them quite a reputation for impiety and obstinacy. Rebels. And we get a glimpse of how Christians were seen through the eyes of Roman officials from documents of the time. For example, we look around 112, where Pliny the Younger was the governor of Bithynia, who had wrote to Emperor Trajan about how to deal with people accused of being Christians. Pliny observed that Christians would not curse Christ or offer wine and incense to the emperor's statue when ordered, behaviors that confirmed their, quote, stubborn and inflexible obstinacy. But he did note, however, aside from their refusal to honor Roman gods, that these Christians actually seemed quite harmless. Along with their practices and rituals, they weren't hurting anybody. You see, they met before dawn to sing hymns to Christ, and bound themselves by oath to avoid crimes like theft or adultery. And this is where Pliny was a little bit puzzled. He still executed those who persisted openly in their faith, but released those who recanted, following Trajan's advice not to seek out Christians proactively. This early correspondence shows a kind of ambivalence from Rome, certainly uncertain whether Christians were merely eccentric or a genuine threat to social order. They'd not quite worked it out yet. And of course the persecutions of a little bit later time had not quite kicked off, but we'll get to them. Now, from the Roman perspective, the new sect also aroused suspicions of disloyalty and even treason, and we all know what that gets you in Rome. After all, Christians wouldn't sacrifice to the emperor's spirit, called the genius in Latin, undermining the state religion that bound the empire together. Rumors also portrayed Christian gatherings as depraved orgies or baby-eating rituals, wild fabrications stemming from Christians calling each other brother and sister, which, to outsiders, suggested a kind of connotation of incest. And then there was this speaking of eating Christ's body and blood in communion, which, of course, without the proper context, you can see how people would kind of run away with that wording. Well, slanders like this show up in the apologies or the defensive works written by early Christian intellectuals around 197. Tertullian of Carthage, for example, wrote a passionate defense of Christianity, appropriately titled Apology. If you want to look that up, the Apology of Tertullian, you'll be able to find it on probably Gutenberg. They'll have it. Well, in this work, he turned the accusations on their head. You see, far from being immoral, he argued, Christians actually lived virtuously and upheld order, while it was the pagan society that was actually the one rife with vice. Tertullian also pointed out the futility of trying to destroy the church by force, In a memorable phrase addressing the Roman authorities, he declared, quote, "We multiply whenever we are mown down by you. The blood of Christians is seed." Now, this is often quoted as well as, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." That's a catchy little saying, isn't it? And, well, it can't be argued with. It's quite true. The more violence that the Christians experienced, well, the more the movement grew. In other words, each martyrdom just inspired more conversions, a paradox that would prove true repeatedly in the centuries to come. I'll give you one early incident of persecution that became quite infamous. There's a little bit of argument about it, but we should address it. That's Emperor Nero's scapegoating of Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in 64. According to the historian Tacitus, under a catastrophic blaze, much of the city was devastated. Now, Nero, who was famous for being, not a very nice guy, to say the least, he widely suspected Christians of starting the fire, whereas he himself was the one who was suspected by the general populace of doing it. But the Christians, of course, were a convenient group to blame. So he chose the Christian sect, still small at the time, perhaps too small to form a proper resistance, but already regarded with a general hatred by most of the population. This is still very early days. We are not in the time of Tertullian's Apology. So, Tacitus describes how Christians were tortured and killed in Nero's gardens, some even sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs, others crucified, or even burned as living torches to light up the night sky. Though Tacitus had little sympathy for the, quote, depraved Christian superstition, he still expressed quite a bit of pity for their suffering, noting that Nero's cruelty backfired and aroused public compassion for the victims. Of course, this is just one other episode of Nero that's tied to his personal cruelty, but it certainly set a precedent. You see, Christians could be convenient targets when the state needed a scapegoat or wanted to enforce religious uniformity. Over the 2nd century, Christianity continued to grow despite all this. Quietly, but steadily, even as it remained officially illegal. Now, illegal being they were typically prosecuted under the charge of refusing to worship the gods, and thus atheism was the charge, or disloyalty. It was not so much illegal to be a Christian, but it was more illegal to not be in line with the official imperial cult and the official pagan worship practices. So it wasn't just Christians who were being targeted. It was anyone who wasn't fitting in. You see, there wasn't any empire-wide policy to hunt them down yet. But sporadic persecutions did flare. Christians tried to explain their faith to their educated pagan contemporaries. Works by Justin Martyr, who wrote another apology addressed to the Emperor Antoninus Pius, and other apologists aimed to show that Christians were not dangerous conspirators, but rather law-abiding people praying for the empire's welfare. But despite such efforts, I'm sure you can see how misunderstandings remained. Popular sentiment often ran against the Christians, easy targets to blame when disasters struck. A common slogan was Christianos ad leones, Christians to the lions. In Lyon, in Gaul, around 177, for instance, a mob outbreak led to the torture and execution of dozens of Christians in the arena, including a slave girl, Blandina, who, though physically frail, heroically endured days of torment and became a celebrated martyr. Stories of such steadfast faith under trial circulated among Christians, and non-Christians too, inspiring quite a bit of awe. And by the end of the 2nd century, the church had grown sizable enough that these martyrdom narratives, letters, and histories of local churches were being compiled by figures like the Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, and later the historian Eusebius of Caesarea. But still, Christians were likely only a small minority, perhaps on the order of a few % of the population, as the empire entered the 3rd century. Yet their distinctive refusal to assimilate to Rome's religious expectation meant that tensions with imperial authority could only remain unresolved. And it was these unresolved tensions, the context that they were in, that set the stage for more intense clashes in the coming century. Now, as for the 3rd century, it proved to be a time of both crisis and refinement for the Christians. The Roman Empire was racked by turmoil during the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, and a crisis it was indeed. Plagues, economic troubles, nearly constant wars, and quite a handful of usurpers as well. In such times like this, such stressful periods, emperors look to restore the Pax Deorum, as they call it, that peace of the gods. And to do that, one had to enforce religious conformity. So, for the first time, we see the persecution of Christians becoming an empire-wide policy rather than a sporadic local flare-up. These persecutions, though brutal, ironically strengthened the Christian identity and produced some of the Church's most revered saints and inspiring stories. Let's start in 250. Emperor Decius initiated the first empire-wide persecution. He issued an edict requiring all subjects to perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods and the genius of the emperor. Remember that word genius being spirit. And they also had to obtain a certificate called a libellus, proving that they had done so. As you can imagine, this poses a unique dilemma for Christians. To comply with that meant apostasy, that is, renouncement of the faith. But refusing it, well, that could mean torture or death. Many Christians stood firm and became martyrs. Others, however, lapsed. They yielded under pressure, made the sacrifices. But some managed to obtain false certificates. Either way, the Church thus faced not only external threats, but an internal spiritual crisis. What were they going to do with those who had denied the faith to save their life once the persecution ended? Do you welcome them back with open arms? I suppose that would be the Christian thing to do. There was a rigorous faction that argued that the lapsed Christians could not easily be forgiven or readmitted, while more lenient bishops like Cyprian of Carthage urged that after appropriate penance, even those who fell under duress should be welcomed back into the fold. These debates prepared the ground for later divisions, such as the Donatist controversy, which we will talk about a little later, revolving around the purity of the Church and the validity of sacraments performed by compromised clergy. Now, although Decius's persecution abated after his short reign, as he got killed in battle in 251, by the way, a new wave hit under Emperor Valerian around 257 to 260. Valerian targeted Christian clergy and prominent Christians, even arresting bishops like Cyprian, who was exiled and later executed, and confiscating church property. Yet this too passed. For a time, Christians enjoyed relative peace and some imperial favor under the new ruler Gallienus, who issued an Edict of Tolerance. By the later 3rd century, the church had grown in organization. Bishops led well-structured communities in most cities, and Christianity was spreading beyond urban centers. Intriguingly, by this time, some members of the aristocracy had even converted, and the church in Rome was sizable enough to attract substantial donations. And that's what set the stage for an even more dramatic confrontation. A strong emperor decided to unify the empire by enforcing religious uniformity one last time. And here we have the Great Persecution under Emperor Diocletian at the turn of the 4th century, the most intense and systematic attempt to eradicate Christianity. It began in 303. Diocletian, urged on especially by his Caesar Galerius, issued a series of edicts aimed at the Christian church. Churches were to be demolished. Christian books and scriptures were to be seized and burned, and the Christians themselves removed from public office, stripped of all legal rights. Later edicts demanded that all inhabitants sacrifice to the gods on pain of death or forced labor. Diocletian's government hunted down clergy, hoping to decapitate the leadership of the church, and forced many communities to worship the imperial cult by brute force. Across the Eastern Empire in particular, that was, by the way, where Galerius and other zealously anti-Christian officials held sway, terrible atrocities were recorded. Eusebius, an eyewitness in Palestine, wrote of crowded prisons, torture chambers, and countless martyrs from Africa to Gaul. Some had their heads removed. Others were thrown to beasts in spectacles intended to terrorize the populace. Others died in dank mines or cruel captivity. In any case, there was no real easy way out. But it was during this period that some of the most vivid martyrdom stories emerged, fueling Christian memory and identity. Let's talk about the famous account of the Passion of Saints Perpetua and Felicitas, which actually dates a little bit earlier, 203 in Carthage, but was cherished and read during later persecutions as well. Start with Perpetua. It was a young Roman noble woman, a new mother, who along with her slave Felicitas and others were arrested for her Christian faith. While awaiting execution, Perpetua kept a diary in prison, a rare and precious first-person testimony of a martyr's mindset. It was in this diary that she recorded her mystical visions and the struggle between her family and her higher loyalty to Christ. In one scene, Perpetua's aging father pleads with her just to offer a token pinch of incense to the emperor that might manage to save her life. But she responds by pointing to a simple water jug in her cell and saying, "Father, do you see this vase here? Could it be called by any other name, by what it is?" When her father answered no, she answered back, "Well, so too I cannot be called anything other than what I am, and I am a Christian." A pretty resolute declaration, an unyielding conviction, suiting only of a martyr. And so Perpetua and Felicitas indeed went bravely to their deaths in the arena, gored by wild cows, and finished off by the sword, their courage inspiring all who heard the tale. Such stories read aloud in congregations gave heart to those facing threats and helped persuade wavering souls that faithfulness, even unto death, was a victory of the spirit, if not one of the flesh. But despite Diocletian's ferocity, the Great Persecution failed to destroy Christianity. In the western provinces, the campaign was shorter and less thorough. In the east, Galerius continued the persecution even after Diocletian's retirement in 305, but eventually even Galerius had to admit defeat. From his deathbed in 311, Galerius issued an extraordinary edict ending the persecution. In this Edict of Toleration of 311, Galerius acknowledged the attempts to force Christians to return to the old gods had all failed. He grudgingly granted Christians permission to practice their faith, asking their gods indulgence for Rome's welfare. A pivotal reversal. The first time a Roman law recognized Christians as a lawful religion. The age of martyrs was drawing to a close, just as a new contender for imperial power was rising in the West, who would transform the relationship between the Roman state and the Church forever. I'm sure you can guess who we're talking about. Say it out loud before I do. Well, if you said Constantine the Great, you would be correct. Congratulations. I'm afraid I don't have any prize to give you. But we'll continue on with the video. It was Constantine that marked the dawn of a revolution of sorts. The first Christian emperor, and ultimately the beginning of Rome's official transformation into a Christian empire. Constantine's personal journey to Christianity and his policies favoring the Church were turning points both politically and religiously. He ruled from 306 to 337, and under this rule, Christianity transformed from a persecuted faith to an imperially favored religion, enjoying state patronage and prestige that it had never imagined possible. The most legendary episode of Constantine's life is his conversion experience in 312, on the eve of a crucial battle. You see, at that time, Constantine was one of several rival claimants to imperial power, vying for control of the Western Empire. As he marched toward Rome to confront his enemy Maxentius, Constantine is said to have sought divine aid. So according to two of the sources we have from the time, the Christian writers Lactantius and Eusebius, who both recorded slightly different versions, Constantine received a heavenly sign. Lactantius writes that the night before the battle, Constantine dreamed that Christ directed him to paint the Rho, that is, the cross sign with the P on top of it. It looks like that, but it's actually the first two Greek letters of Christ. He wanted to paint this on the soldiers' shields. Eusebius of Caesarea, who later wrote the life of Constantine, includes Constantine's own testimony that around noon he saw the vision of a cross of light in the sky with an inscription in Greek, "By this, conquer." That night, Christ appeared to him in a dream. And well, that only reinforced the message, didn't it? Heartened by this divine omen, Constantine adopted the sign of the cross as his standard, famously marching into the Battle of Milvian Bridge under a Christian symbol. On October 28th, 312, Constantine's forces won a decisive victory against Maxentius, who legend says drowned in the Tiber during the rout. Constantine entered Rome as a victor and attributed his success to the God of the Christians. Though the exact details of the vision are pretty debatable, what is clear is that Constantine emerged from this conflict convinced of the power of Christ. He stopped offering sacrifices to pagan gods, and from then on, he openly favored Christianity. Though it is likely that his faith developed gradually, and he still tolerated old practices, at least for a time. In any case, in 313, Constantine, now ruling the west, and Licinius, his ally ruling the east, issued the famous Edict of Milan, a proclamation that did not make Christianity the state church, that would come a bit later, but did grant it full religious toleration throughout all of the empire. The edict declared that, quote, "No one whatsoever should be denied the opportunity to follow the religion that they choose, explicitly including Christianity and every other faith." It's pretty remarkable for the year 313, don't you think? Well, more concretely, it ordered that confiscated Christian property, church buildings, cemeteries, things like this, be restored completely, and that Christians be allowed to worship freely without any harassment. But all in all, the edict was a turning point. It ended this institutional persecution and legitimized Christianity as equal under the law to a traditional religion. Those ages of hiding in catacombs were all over. The church could now step out into the open. And step out it certainly did. The ball was well and truly rolling now. As for Constantine, as you can imagine, he quickly became a patron of the church. He lavished imperial favor on the Christian clergy, granting bishops legal privileges, exempting priests from certain taxes and public duties, and pouring state funds into the construction of grand churches. In Rome, he donated the old palace of the Laterani to be the site of the first grand basilica, that being the Lateran Basilica for the Bishop of Rome. Effectively, the first St. Peter's of the city, if you want to put it like that. He also built a splendid basilica over what was believed to be the tomb of St. Peter on the Vatican Hill. He commissioned churches in the Holy Land too, sending his mother, Empress Helena, on a famous pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where she actually sponsored the building of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at the site of Christ's tomb, and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Across the empire, new Christian basilicas began to rise, sometimes directly atop of demolished pagan temples. Certainly much to the chagrin of the pagans still holding on to those old ways, as you can imagine. A little rude, but, well, that's just how it is. These impressive structures, often funded by imperial or aristocratic benefactors, were a tangible symbol that the times had certainly changed. Where once Christians had worshipped quietly in their homes, now the public could see massive congregations gathering under gilded roofs to celebrate their rites in broad daylight without fear. In fact, we got some contemporary accounts that speak of popular amazement among Christians, joyful among pagans sometimes, perplexed or resentful at the speed in which the cross came to adorn public spaces. One writer describes cities, quote, glittering with basilicas as the construction boom took off. Ordinary citizens who fought for generations had been accustomed to processions honoring Jupiter or Mars, now saw imperial processions carrying Christian icons, and the once scorned sect enjoyed the favor of the higher-ups. However, Constantine's embrace of Christianity was not purely spiritual or altruistic. It actually had a kind of political dimension to it. Let me explain. He perceived, perhaps quite shrewdly, that the Christian church, with its strong organization and universal appeal, could be a unifying force in the empire that desperately needed unity. The early 4th century had seen civil wars and divisions. A common faith endorsed by the emperor could strengthen imperial authority, but it also meant that disunity within the church became a matter of imperial concern. Constantine soon found himself entangled in internal Christian disputes, the most significant of which, of course, was the Arian controversy. Only a few years after Constantine's victory, a theological dispute flared up in Alexandria that threatened to split the Christian community. A priest named Arius was teaching a Christology, that essentially argued Christ is subordinate to the Father. That meaning that the Son of God was not co-eternal with God and the Father, but rather the first and greatest creature made by God. In even simpler terms, Arius maintained there was a time when the Son was not. This teaching appealed to many who were trying to preserve a strict monotheism so that the Son's divinity wouldn't seem to duplicate the Father's, but to others it was quite alarming, who felt that Arius was denying Christ's true divine nature. The dispute spread beyond Alexandria, and soon the entire Eastern Church was divided over whether Jesus Christ was fully God or some lesser divine being, a demigod, a blessed prophet. The arguments were certainly starting to begin. Constantine, concerned that a divided church would undermine the unity of the empire he'd worked so hard to secure, took an unprecedented step. In 325, he called an ecumenical council, the First Council of Nicaea, summoning bishops from all over the empire to settle this matter once and for all. At Nicaea, over 200 bishops, though some accounts say it was up to 318, gathered under the patronage of the emperor. As for Constantine himself, he opened the council, dressed in splendid robes and reportedly giving the assembled bishops the utmost respect. Many of these bishops still bore the scars from recent persecutions, but, well, it's all in the past. The theological debate at Nicaea was intense. Church leaders like Athanasius of Alexandria, a deacon and a young aide to his bishop, by the way, argued vigorously against Arius's position, insisting that Jesus Christ was of the same substance as the Father, fully divine, not a demigod or some supreme angel, but one in the same with God. After weeks of discussion, the council overwhelmingly rejected Arianism and produced what would be known as the Nicene Creed, a declaration of faith that explicitly calls Christ, quote, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. According to later legends, Arius's arguments were so strained that at one point St. Nicholas, yes, by the way, the inspiration for Santa Claus, then a bishop of Myra, apparently got up and slapped Arius across the face. Which, well, that's an argument in its own. While that colourful anecdote, by the way, might not be apocryphal, or may be apocryphal rather, it does capture the fervour surrounding this doctrinal dispute. Now, as for Constantine, for his part, he was pleased to see consensus and unity restored. He enforced the council's decision. Arius was exiled, and imperial edicts forbade the dissemination of his teachings. The Council of Nicaea was certainly a milestone. It defined orthodox Trinitarian doctrine for the Church and set a precedent for emperors intervening in church affairs to maintain unity. Constantine's later years further cemented the Christianization of the empire. He defeated Licinius, who had later relapsed into persecuting Christians in the East and became sole emperor. He founded a new capital city too, Constantinople, in 330 AD on the site of Byzantium, designating it as a new Christian Rome. He then filled it with churches, and devoid of old pagan temples that had dominated the old Rome, the city was quite a new feel. But he did not outlaw traditional Roman cults altogether. In fact, he remained Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the old religion, and pagan temples continued to function during his reign. But he did progressively privilege Christianity. For example, in 321, he proclaimed Sunday as a public holiday, the Christian day of worship, ordering that courts and workshops must be closed. He also abolished certain cruel customs influenced by Christian ethics. Gladiatorial combat was discouraged and later outlawed by his successors. Branding of criminals on the face was also banned. The face, being in God's image, should not be disfigured, it was argued, and crucifixion as a method of execution was largely abandoned out of reverence for the way that Christ had died. Constantine even encouraged the emancipation of slaves. He made it legal to free slaves in a church ceremony, or rather he made it legal to do so, integrating Roman law with Christian ritual. And so by the time that Constantine had died in 337, baptized on his deathbed, by the way, by an Arian-leaning bishop, quite ironically, Rome had undeniably turned a corner. Christianity was the favored religion at the highest levels of power. The church's formerly persecuted leaders were now sought-after advisors and bureaucrats. Magnificent cathedrals anchored the skylines of major cities. Bishops wielded influence and wealth, and the once despised symbol of the cross was now emblazoned on military standards, imperial regalia, and even coins. Yet the story is far from over. The 4th century had more drama in store. Constantine's dynasty and their successors would continue to grapple with struggles for orthodoxy within the church and confront both pagan reaction and new heresies. So let's turn now to those theological and political battles that marked those first 50 years after Constantine. But even after the Council of Nicaea, achieving a unity of belief, well, that's going to be quite a challenge. The victory of Nicene theology was not immediate or uncontested in the empire, you see. In fact, for decades after Nicaea, the controversy surrounding Arianism continued to roil the church and involve emperors in high-stakes theological political disputes. Meanwhile, there was another significant dispute, the Donatist Schism, testing the relationship between church purity and state authority, especially in North Africa. It was these conflicts that showed how the process of Rome becoming Christian was not merely a political coin flip, but of a switch, involved intense internal debates as the church defined its doctrines and the emperors increasingly took on the role of enforcers of orthodoxy. As for the Arian controversy, it didn't end with Arian's exile. Many bishops, especially in the Eastern Empire, had been uneasy with the term homousios. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies to any ancient Greeks listening. It just means of one substance. That is this term used within the Nicene Creed. They feared that it sounded like Sabellianism, a heresy that blurred the distinctions between father and son. In the years after Constantine, a number of church leaders tried to find compromise formulas. This term of similar substance and other such semantic tweaks to reconcile Arians and Nicenes. The emperor himself, persuaded by one of his advisors, recalled Arius from exile in 327 and sought to reintegrate him. Though Arius had died suddenly in 336, in a manner pro-Nicenes considered an act of God. Well, that's certainly up for debate. I don't think God's out there assassinating his opponents, but, who knows? In any case, Constantius II, who eventually became the sole ruler, favored the Arian, or more accurately, semi-Arian side of the debate. Under his reign, many staunch Nicene bishops were deposed and exiled. The most prominent of these was St. Athanasius of Alexandria, the same fiery champion of Nicaea who had crossed swords with Arius. Athanasius became a symbol of unwavering orthodoxy. Exiled 5 times by various emperors and Arian-leaning councils, he persisted in teaching that Christ was fully God. A phrase arose: Athanasius contra mundum, which basically means Athanasius versus the world. Hang on, I've lost my part where I'm reading. Sorry. Okay, I found it, excuse me. Sorry to break the third wall there. Anyway, this phrase, Athanasius against the world, reflected how he stood almost alone at times, defending Nicene Christianity when it seemed that the majority of bishops, and the imperial court, by the way, had tilted towards this Arian interpretation. Athanasius wrote theological treatises, like Orations Against the Arians, refuting Arianism point by point, insisting, for example, that only if Christ were truly God could he bestow immortality upon humanity. Quote, he became what we are, so that he might make us what he is, an argument that salvation itself was at stake in this doctrine. Well, back in the West, Constantius's brothers, Constantine II and Constans, had been more sympathetic to Nicaea, and the Church in Rome always held to the Nicene Creed. Thus, the empire was divided, not only politically but theologically during the mid-4th century. Several church councils were convened by imperial authority to try and broker a kind of theological compromise. For instance, the Council of Rimini in 359 in the west, and a parallel council at Seleucia in the east. These largely resulted in confusing semi-Arian statements. It is said that after the Council of Rimini, which many Western bishops attended under duress from Constantius, St. Jerome had lamented, quote, the whole world groaned and was astonished to find itself Arian. Orthodox Christians felt beleaguered. However, change would come when the imperial leadership shifted. In 361, Emperor Constantius died, and his successor would take a very different approach, but not pro-Nicene. Oh no, shockingly pagan. We'll get to that in a moment. Bit of a revival. But before we do, ultimately we have to say that the Arian crisis within the empire was resolved during the reign of Emperor Theodosius I, who, as we shall see, decisively sided with Nicene orthodoxy. In 381, Theodosius convened the Council of Constantinople, which reaffirmed and expanded the Nicene Creed, clarifying the full divinity of the Holy Spirit as well, effectively ending the imperial support for Arianism. After that point, those Christians who still clung to Arian beliefs were labeled heretics and lost any state backing, though notably Arian Christianity survived for a while among the Gothic and Germanic tribes just outside the empire, who had been converted by Arian missionaries quite a bit earlier. This set up future conflicts, of course, when those tribes invaded the still Nicene Roman populace. But parallel to the Arian dispute, Another significant conflict unfolded primarily in North Africa. We have mentioned the Donatist Schism. This controversy predated Constantine's conversion, but actually was intensified rather by it. It revolved around the question, who is worthy to serve and lead in the church, especially after the time of persecution? During Diocletian's persecution, some bishops and priests in North Africa had handed over scriptures or had made compromising gestures to save themselves. They were pejoratively called traitors. After the persecution had ended, the church in Carthage split over whether such people, in this case a bishop named Caecilian, consecrated by a traitor bishop, could hold office. The rigorist faction, insisting on a pure clergy of confessors, denied Caecilian's legitimacy and elected their own bishop, being one Majorinus, succeeded by Donatus, from whom the movement gets its name. The Donatists argued that sacraments like baptism, for example, performed by traitors, were invalid, essentially that the effectiveness of ministry depended on the holiness of the minister. The majority Catholic position, articulated later by St. Augustine, held that the sacrament's holiness comes from God and the Church, not any individual minister's moral state, and that the unity and forgiveness parts were paramount. So what makes the Donatist controversy particularly important in the context of Rome becoming Christian is that it was the first major intra-Christian dispute where the imperial government was forced to intervene. In 313, the Donatists appealed to Constantine to arbitrate, perhaps hoping that the new Christian emperor would side with the stricter party. But Constantine, however, after investigation, ruled against them. When the Donatists refused to accept the decision, Constantine eventually sent officials and troops to enforce the Catholic bishop and suppress the Donatist ones. Of course, blood was unfortunately shed. Donatist churches were confiscated, and this was quite startling. Only a few years after persecution had ended, now Christians were using imperial force against other Christians over a matter of discipline and purity. Oh, how the turntables, right? Well, Donatism proved to be resilient. It had deep popular support in parts of North Africa. Constantine at one point had actually lamented that the dispute was interminable and was even granted a measure of tolerance to Donatists in his later years. And this schism persisted for centuries, flaring up again and again. It had to be addressed by St. Augustine of Hippo in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, who exhaustively debated Donatist leaders and wrote tracts like On Baptism and Letter to Petilian against their claims. Augustine, while urging the Donatists to reunite, also justified the use of imperial laws to curb schism, coining the phrase, compelled them to come in, quoting scripture to endorse a firm hand in restoring heretics to orthodoxy. Well, this whole episode, oh, I'm losing my mind. I've been talking for too long, excuse me. It shows that by the early 5th century, that being a Roman meant being an Orthodox, that being Nicene Catholic Christian, and any deviations, whether Arian or Donatist, would simply not be tolerated by the state. But let's move on to 361, where Rome witnessed a curious about-face. An emperor ascended to the throne who openly abandoned Christianity and bought back the good old days of the old pagan gods. That was Julian, known to history as Julian the Apostate. Julian's short reign from 361 to 63 is a pretty fascinating interlude, a conscious attempt to roll back the Christianization of the empire and restore paganism's pride of place. Though brief and ultimately unsuccessful, it shows a bit of insight into how far Christianity had come and how deeply it had altered the fabric of Roman society by mid-century, that even a pagan emperor, with all of his strength and connections, could not turn back the tide. So who was Julian? Well, he was a nephew of Constantine, raised during the decades when Constantine's sons and successors, though not always orthodox, still upheld Christianity as the imperial religion. As a young man, Julian received a thorough classical education and secretly became enamored of Neoplatonic philosophy and the ancient Hellenic gods. He felt that his cousin, the Emperor Constantinius II, and the Christian court had hypocritically murdered members of Julian's family, which perhaps soured him on the new religion. So once he gained power, he dramatically announced his conversion back to paganism. He cast himself as the head of a pagan renaissance. Rather than openly persecuting Christians, his strategy was to marginalize and humiliate the church, while at the same time revitalizing the old pagan worship. One of the first acts was to remove the privileges Constantine and his sons had given the church. He removed Christians from high office, barred Christian teachers from using the classical literature in schools, essentially trying to exclude them from teaching Greek and Latin classics, reasoning that those works honored pagan gods, and recalled pagan temple lands and subsidies. He also invited back all the exiled Christian bishops, including previously banned heretical leaders like Arian bishops and Donatists, but not because he liked them, but because he calculated that their mutual disagreements would fracture the overall unity of Christianity. In fact, it was quite a calculated policy of divide and conquer. Pretty clever. Letting Christian sects wrangle and keep them preoccupied while the real work is done behind the scenes. Well, most tellingly, Julian tried to reorganize paganism to imitate some of Christianity's strengths. He established a hierarchy of pagan priests in the cities and urged them to live exemplary lives of piety and morality, effectively calling them to the same standards of that Christian clergy. He wrote letters to pagan high priests, advising them on how to carry out charitable works. Julian had observed that Christian charity was a powerful draw. Christians were caring for the poor, widows and orphans, not only among their own, but even among non-Christians. In one famous letter, Julian lamented, quote, "The impious Galileans, or Christians, support not only their own poor, but ours as well. All men see that our people lack aid from us." He urged the pagan priesthood to match the benevolence of the Christians, to set up hostels for travelers, to spy and distribute bread to the needy, and practice virtues of compassion. Basically, he was acknowledging that Christianity's social ethos was winning hearts and minds. He attempted to graft those ideas onto polytheism to bolster its appeal. But he also undertook a grand and rather provocative project. He announced plans to rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. This was not because he believed in Judaism, but as an act of anti-Christian policy. You see, the temple had been destroyed since 70 AD, and Christians widely believed it was God's providence that it remained so, since Jesus had predicted its downfall and the church saw itself as the new temple. Julian aimed to discredit Christian prophecy and perhaps win favor with Jews and others opposed to Christianity by restoring a famous non-Christian religious center. The project, however, never came to fruition. According to later accounts, somewhat embroidered perhaps by Christian writers, mysterious fires and even an earthquake disrupted the rebuilding. And of course, the believers took that as a sign of divine opposition. In any case, Julian's death shortly thereafter put an end to the plan. Julian's pagan revival was energetic, but revealed how much had changed in the 50 years since Constantine had passed. Traditional Roman paganism itself had to be reinvented and even militarized to stand a chance against the now well-established church. Many ordinary citizens, especially in the cities and in the imperial administration, were by then well and truly Christian. They had no interest in returning to the old ways. Julian found that out. His attempts to promote sacrifices and pagan rites sometimes met apathy or even covert resistance. While on campaign against Persia in 363, he reportedly became frustrated that Christian soldiers in his ranks quietly sang Christian hymns instead of participating in his pagan sacrifices. He is said to have mocked Christ as unable to save them from the Persian steel. In a twist of fate, Julian himself was mortally wounded in a skirmish during the campaign. Later Christian legend claims that as he died, he uttered the words, "Vicisti Galilee," "You have conquered, Galilean," acknowledging that Christ had triumphed over his attempt to restore the old gods. Well, we're not quite sure if that's true. Whether or not it is, or these exact words were spoken, the sentiment certainly held that Julian's counter-revolution had failed utterly. His reign, though short, actually ended up strengthening Christianity's position, like drawing back a bowstring or changing gear on a car. Well, it only just made the eventual snapback after his death even stronger. By removing imperial favor for a time, he gave Christians a chance to realize how far they had come and to rally in defense of their faith's intellectual and perceived moral superiority over the pagan one. Notably, one of Julian's lasting impacts was the stimulus he gave to Christian intellectuals to articulate why Christianity was true and beneficial, whereas paganism was not. Figures like St. Gregory of Nazianzus and St. Basil of Caesarea wrote responses to Julian's treatises. Julian had actually penned a critique of Christianity called Against the Galileans. The experience proved that even without imperial backing, the church had a robust life of its own now. After Julian, no emperor would openly renounce Christianity again. The future arguments would be about what kind of Christianity, Nicene, Arian, etc., and what the empire would really be choosing. The argument of whether the empire was going to be Christian at all, well, that was well and truly settled at this point. In any case, by the year 380, Christianity had evolved from a tolerated faith into the imperial orthodoxy. This was solidified under Emperor Theodosius I, who earned the title the Great, in part for his role in stamping Christianity's primacy on Roman policy. Under Theodosius, the final steps were taken. Nicene Christian doctrine was declared the empire's sole official religion. Heresies outlawed, and state patronage of traditional pagan cults was definitively ended. The transformation of Rome into a Christian state reached its culmination, although not without resistance and drama, including a famed confrontation between Theodosius and Bishop Ambrose of Milan. I will get to that. When Theodosius came to power, the empire was still grappling with Arianism. In fact, the Eastern Empire, which he ruled, had many Arian or semi-Arian bishops in place thanks to prior emperors. Theodosius himself was a Spaniard by birth, raised as a Nicene Christian. Almost immediately upon becoming Augustus of the East in 379, he signaled his stance by undergoing Christian baptism while gravely ill, an emergency baptism that he recovered from, unlike Constantine, who waited till his deathbed. In February of 380, just a year into his rule and shortly after a joint victory against the usurper, Theodosius issued a remarkable edict in Thessalonica, co-signed with the Western emperors Gratian and Valentinian II. This Edict of Thessalonica, known as Cunctus Populos from its opening Latin words, proclaimed that all peoples under Roman rule should hold the faith of the bishops of Rome and Alexandria, that is, the Nicene faith in the Trinity. It explicitly identified the Trinitarian doctrine of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as the only orthodox creed. Anything else was, well, in their point of view, not real Christianity. The edict states, quote, "According to the apostolic teaching and the doctrine of the gospel, let us believe in the one deity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In equal majesty and Holy Trinity, we authorize the followers of this law to assume the title of Catholic Christians. But as for the others, since in our judgment they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics." So those not adhering to the Catholic, i.e. universal Nicene faith, were denied the right to call their gatherings churches, and were subject to other state penalties. So if there was ever a watershed moment, this was it. Not seen since the days of Constantine's vision, Christian orthodoxy had become entwined with loyalty to the Roman state, and to be a heretic was now not just a religious deviation, but a civil offense. Theodosius followed this up by personally involving himself in ecclesiastical matters. He arrived in Constantinople in late 380 and immediately expelled the Arian bishop Demophilus, handing the city's churches over to the staunch Nicene theologian Gregory of Nazianzus. In 381, Theodosius convened the Second Ecumenical Council at Constantinople. This council affirmed the Nicene Creed and extended it to clarify the divinity of the Holy Spirit, condemning a new heresy, by the way, Macedonianism, which denied the Spirit's divinity. The Council of Constantinople in 381 effectively sealed the triumph of Nicene orthodoxy within the empire. Arianism was officially anathematized, though Arian Christian Goths and others outside the empire remained. Within Roman borders, their assemblies were increasingly outlawed. Theodosius backed these decrees with the force of law. In the years 381 to 391, a series of imperial edicts targeted pagan practices and the last holdouts of the old cults. Theodosius ordered that pagan temples be closed, that public sacrifices, especially blood sacrifices, cease immediately under pain of legal prosecution, and that pagan holidays would also lose their official status. In 382, he refused to restore the altar of victory in the Senate House of Rome, a significant decision because that altar, a statue of the goddess of victory, had been a symbol of the old religion's place at the heart of Roman government. Earlier, Emperor Gratian had removed it, and when prominent pagan senators like Symmachus petitioned for its return, Theodosius denied the request, affirming that the state no longer honored the traditional gods, even in the Senate. Symmachus had eloquently argued for religious pluralism. Quote, "Everyone has their own customs and gods. Let ancient traditions be respected." But Ambrose of Milan wrote rebuttals, insisting that error has no rights in a Christian empire, and that it would be offensive to Christ to place an idol back in the Senate. But one of the most dramatic events, illustrating both the end of pagan state religion and the new power of the Church, was the confrontation between Emperor Theodosius and Bishop Ambrose. In 390, the populace of Thessalonica rioted and murdered a Roman commander. In a furious reprisal, Theodosius ordered a brutal punishment, the massacre of several thousand inhabitants of the city, in an indiscriminate slaughter. Now this act actually appalled Ambrose, the influential bishop of Milan, where Theodosius often resided, and Ambrose took the extraordinary step of publicly rebuking the Christian emperor and barring him from entering Milan's cathedral or receiving the Eucharist until he performed penance for his atrocity. Initially, Theodosius bristled at the cleric's audacity, but Ambrose stood firm. According to some accounts, when Theodosius arrived at the church, Ambrose met him at the door and told him to imitate the biblical King David in repentance for his sin, reminding the emperor that even a ruler is not above God's law. In an astonishing display of humility and political prudence, perhaps, Theodosius complied. He shed his imperial purple, donned simple penitential garb, and publicly did penance for months, abstaining from his royal privileges of worship until Christmas, when Ambrose finally absolved him. This incident sent a powerful message. In the Christian Roman Empire, the emperor himself was subject to moral judgment by the Church. The Church had gained a role as the conscience of the state, something unthinkable in the old pagan order where emperors were chief priests and accountable to no earthly authority in religious matters. Theodosius also oversaw or permitted actions that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The active destruction of some prominent pagan temples, for example. In 391 in Alexandria, the great Serapeum, a magnificent temple to the god Serapis, and a symbol of Greco-Egyptian paganism, was destroyed by a Christian mob, with explicit approval from the imperial authorities and the bishop Theophilus. The cold statue of Serapis was smashed to pieces, and a church was later built on the site. Similarly, in the eastern provinces, many temples were converted into churches, or simply fell into disuse without state funding or legal protection. Theodosius in 393 even abolished the ancient Olympic Games, since these festival games were originally dedicated to Zeus and had lingering pagan religious elements. With one imperial edict after another, the venerable institutions of classical paganism were being either co-opted or extinguished. But it is important to note that these changes did not mean that every individual subject of the empire was now a baptized, believing Christian. In many areas, especially rural districts, old customs died hard. The very word, Paganus, which actually means country dweller, by the way, became synonymous with a follower of the old religions, precisely because many rural folk clung to the old gods and rites longer than city populations that were more directly influenced by imperial policy and church presence. For decades, even centuries to come, Christian bishops and monks would be working to convert pockets of the countryside, where villagers still poured libations to local deities or kept household idols. Missionary bishops like St. Martin of Tours in Gaul exemplify this ongoing effort. Martin went out to remote villages, boldly chopping down sacred trees and smashing pagan altars. A famous legend actually recounts how locals dared Martin to stand in the path of a sacred oak as they cut it down, trusting in God. Martin did so, and miraculously, the falling tree swerved and missed him, leading many of the astonished pagans to convert on the spot. Such colourful anecdotes aside, the term pagan itself reflects the sense that by the 4th century, to be a non-Christian was to be somewhat rustic or old-fashioned, out of step with the mainstream. The empire's cultural momentum was firmly towards Christianity. The elite, imperial court, the army leadership, they were all increasingly identifying as Christian, and nowadays proudly so. As for Theodosius, he was the last emperor to rule over both East and West, and upon his death in 395, he left a dominantly Christian empire to his sons. The laws and social structures were now infused with Christian ideas, and the old state cult of Jupiter, and all of the other gods, were just a relic of the past. Thus, in the span of about 70 years, roughly from Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 to Theodosius' Edict of Thessalonica and subsequent decrees in the 380s, we see a complete reversal of the Roman Empire's religious identity. But what was it like after that? How did a Christian Rome behave compared to a pagan Rome? Well, that's going to require another hour-plus long video. Of course, we have the arguments too that a lot of people make that Christianity and the departure from those old pagan virtues and values was really what did the Roman Empire in. I mean, it's not long after that Rome fell in its traditional sense. But of course, a video for another time. So you got 2 videos coming up. One, did Christianity make Rome fall? That's a good question. Was the abandonment of the old pagan ways the death knell of Roman supremacy? And of course, what was a Christian Rome like compared to a pagan Rome? Perhaps I'll come up with a better title, but you know what I'm getting at. In any case, we are done for today, and as usual, with a customary well-mannered farewell, I will also thank the top-tier patrons who are bankrolling the channel. No ads because of them, so perhaps drop a little thank you in the comments. Yes. We have Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfred, Nia, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Dalbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Vanita, Claire, Cortese, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, hell yeah, and Jennifer. All right, well, that's it from me. I hope that you had a good time. I hope that you learned something. If you're still awake, drop me a little hello in the comments. A lot of people end up falling asleep by this point. Not me, though. I never sleep. All right, well, on that note, thank you very much, everyone. Good night, and take it easy. Lots of love to you all.